Hi and welcome back to my channel. My name is Temi. I am a researcher, PhD student, and sometimes writer living in the UK. Today we are going to talk about my favorite books of 2023, so last year. I don't think this will be a very long video because I just wrote down the books looking at my story graph that I really enjoyed. Not necessarily all 5 stars, although there are 5 stars in this book. But I have 6 books that I would say were my favorite books of last year, and 3 of those are nonfiction. For anyone who doesn't know, I am a researcher. I research Black women's digital lives, particularly looking at things like friendship, intimacy, digital intimacy, and social media. So a lot of the reading that I actually do every day is nonfiction academic work, which is to say that last year's reading approach or my reading strategy was really higgy. It wasn't thought out or like preordained. Like this year, I'm being a lot more intentional about the books I'm reading and trying to read a lot more for pleasure and also read every night before I go to sleep. Last year, I just picked up books as and when I had a moment or needed reprieve from the academic work that I was reading. So I'm gonna split it into nonfiction and fiction, and I actually only have one of the books physically that I read. The rest I think I all read on my Kindle, and the other one, which was definitely my favorite book from last year, I've actually given it to a friend. I've let a friend borrow it. So yeah, the first book, beginning with nonfiction, that was a really favorite read for me last year is Misogynoir Transformed. This is the hardback cover, and you can see I've got all of my annotations in here. This book is by Moya Bailey, who is an assistant professor. I think, where are they at? Yeah, they are an assistant professor in the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies at Northeastern University. So I think that is in Boston. Don't quote me on that. Misogynoir Transformed is about the concept of misogynoir, which is basically racialized sexism that Black women and femmes, or people read as Black women, face and experience in society. And Moya and also another person called Trudy developed this concept of misogynoir back in 2009 or 2010, in sort of the early Black feminist blogosphere days that we don't really see anymore, and it sort of transformed more into social media analysis. This book is a crucial read for anyone who is interested in the ways that gender non-variant, non-binary, trans Black people and Black women make use of content creation to subvert dominant, controlling images of Black womanhood. And so those are ideas like the Black woman as the Jezebel, which is the sexually promiscuous woman who's going to steal your man, or the Black woman as the Mammy, which is sort of this unsexed person who's just there to take care of people and place. Those are controlling, dominant images that we see in media still today. And Moya's work in this book, she looks at different examples of what she calls digital alchemy, which is basically how, different Black women and femmes sort of create content to push back on those images and to really resist those specific stereotypes. They look at Tumblr in particular, and then also look at things like hashtag activism. So they think about I think one of the examples is hashtag #UOKSIS, which was about Black women, particularly African American women, checking up on Black women, Black trans women, to see if they were doing okay, particularly around police brutality and other horrible types of violence. This book for me, the reason why I really love this is because it's super accessible. Again, I'm saying this as someone who is an academic, so for me it felt really accessible. It's such a powerful book, thinking about the ways that Black women's digital activism online can be very powerful and can be what Moya Bailey calls a healing practice. So if you're interested in any of those issues or those themes, then I really recommend that you pick up this book, or better yet, request that your library gets it. Okay, so the next book I have is another nonfiction book. And this is one I don't actually have physically because I think I read it on my Kindle. But this one is Wintering by Catherine May, and I'll like put it here. I read this book at sort of a really transformative or like formative time for me last year. It was when I was just diagnosed with long COVID, and I had just been offered a prestigious residency that I was really excited about, but I remember it so clearly. I went on the first day of the residency and I just felt completely exhausted, and I had effectively like a panic attack, and I was just like, oh my God, I cannot do any more work. I was just so completely exhausted. And unbeknownst to me, I had been living with long COVID for 7 months at that point, but I didn't really know what was going on. I just knew that I felt terrible all the time. So Wintering is a book about what it means for us to have periods of winter, as in seasonal. So in the seasons, what happens for human life or society when it's a period of winter, but then also more interpersonally and individually when you are going through a period of wintering. And I also wrote about this in my Substack, sort of about like how I came to say no, basically. And this also happens for Catherine May. It's a memoir type book, and where they are talking about some of the struggles they've been having and why they felt like they needed to say no. And I think Catherine was diagnosed with autism later on in life, but they really talk about it how from a perspective of maybe a marginalized identity or someone who has a disability, how it's a lot harder to really recognize those signs, and then also to continue to sort of like be outside of the norm and say no and resist. Particularly in situations, I think they work as a writer and an academic. So I found that this really resonated with me, but I don't know what is it about books about women and walking, but I also really loved Wild by Cheryl Strayed when that first came out. And this book really reminds me of this one. And it's not really a book where I felt like I learned anything, but it just felt so comforting to read this sort of meditation on really forcing yourself to say no, even if it comes at some sort of personal, professional sacrifice, but that you know it's necessary for you to be able to continue living well in any way, shape, or form. And it also is just like a really gorgeous meditation on like walking in the sort of the South Downs country in the UK. I'm someone who hikes a lot, so I really love that sort of like imagery that was coming up in the book a lot. And I recommend it to a lot of people because I think a lot of my friends, a lot of my women friends are very ambitious, driven people who are existing in capitalism and existing in this sort of cycle of a boom and bust. We're talking like chronic illness circles, but I think a lot of people are pushing themselves beyond capacity, and it can be really difficult to say no. And I know for me, last year it was really scary to say no and to pull back and to not do those things, not take that residency at that time. But I absolutely needed to because I was unwell. So if you like books about introspection, reflection, about resisting against like the dominant status quo, and also with like gorgeous imagery about walking, then I would recommend Wintering. And that was, I definitely think, one of my top fave books of the year for sure. And then the next and final nonfiction book that was my favorite book entirely of the entire year is Arrangements in Blue. I don't have this book because I gifted it to a friend to read, to borrow. This book by Amy Key, I wanted to inject it into my brain. I wanted it to like be in my body on a cellular level. That is how much I love this book. This book is a memoir, and it is Amy Key talking about what it means to be in a founder body, what it means to be single, and what it means at the intersection of those two things about living a life when you don't have like the coupledom that I think is expected of most contemporary life relationality, right? Like the couple is really much seen as the norm in society. And so what does it mean when you fall out of that norm, particularly as someone in a bigger body? The twist of this book is that Amy writes in relation to Joni Mitchell's album Blue, and she has a really personal relationship with that album. It means something to her. And so throughout her reflection in this book, she weaves in a close reading of Blue's lyrics, and it's just Chef's Kiss. It is such a gorgeous, gorgeous book. I don't have it here. I wish I could show you because I highlighted and annotated so much of this book. This book is really about relationality, and it's about friendship, and it's about loving yourself when society is telling you that you are unlovable, particularly because you are a single fat woman. I love this book. I give this book to all of my friends. I've gifted it to 2 friends already, and it's still in hardback, so it hasn't even reached paperback yet. This book for me just really made me feel so seen, even though Amy Key is a white woman and I am a black woman, so we have differences there, and I'm not someone who lives in a bigger marginalized body. I do still receive marginalization based on misogyny, right, on racialized sexism. And there's something about this book and just how tender and honest Amy is in her writing. There's this gorgeous section about traveling solo as a single woman, and how like difficult it can be to force yourself to go out into these places when you're in these gorgeous spaces but you're solo. And that is something I've experienced because I've done a lot of solo travel, and even though you're in these gorgeous vistas, sometimes you can just feel you can just feel this apprehension to go outside and be solo because everyone is sort of expecting someone else to be with you. And when you're not with someone else, you get this sort of puzzled look. I don't think I'm giving this book enough not due diligence. I don't think I'm describing this book well enough because I'm just going from the cuff. But it is such a gorgeous meditation on learning how to be happy and accept that you might not find romantic love. And I think that is something that is really powerful, and I think something that women should really be able to cope with and also accept. So that was my 6-star read of the year, and it was definitely my favorite book, and it was definitely my favorite memoir that I have read so far. So the next 3 books are all fiction, and the next one I'll talk about is Love Marriage. Love Marriage is a book about like 2 cultures and 2 people. It's by Monica Ali, and I think I've read some of her other books, but I can't remember. I remember picking this up because I kept seeing it elsewhere and like in stores, and I was like, what is that? So it's like this main character, Yasmin, and she's an NHS doctor, and she comes from like a very traditional South Asian background and household. And she has like got this relationship with this partner, Joe, who is a white man who comes from a very affluent background. And you kind of shift between, I think it's Yasmin's perspective, Yasmin's mother's perspective, her brother, and then Joe, and then Joe's mom's perspective. And it's not like a book that I feel like really told me something new about what it means, like, you know, when 2 cultures intermingle or like interracial relationships. But what I loved about this book is that it didn't tie everything up neatly at the end. And so there's conflict, and there is betrayal in this book. And so you see what that betrayal does to Yasmin, what that betrayal does to Joe. There's some weird relationship between Joe and his mother, if I'm remembering correctly, where there's this sort of like overbearing, too close relationship between Joe and his mom, and like how she doesn't want to let him go, but he is kind of like, you know, Mom, like, I'm trying to have my own life now. And then we also talk about, you know, the ways that weaponized benevolence can happen through affluent white families, particularly when they are being joined together through marriage or otherwise. We see that happening through the white mom from Joe, and then Yasmin's mother, who's a South Asian woman, and like how they have these 2 separate understandings of what it means to be women, but how they understand each other. And from Joe's mother's perspective, it's not as genuine, and she's very much doing it as sort of I'm a white saviorism kind of thing. But from Yasmin's mother, her understanding of what it means, or the opportunities that Joe's mother has, you know, from independence and wealth, it really starts to shape and transform her. And so there's this real interesting part about women's relationships, different genders, different races and classes, and the different lessons we can learn from each other in unexpected places. in all of that, it's also quite funny and a lighthearted read. And I think I remember rating this 4 stars because I just was so surprised at the book, and I wasn't expecting it to be that. And I love when books surprise me. So that's Love Marriage by Monica Ali. And then the next book, sorry, I'm just looking it up here in my notes, is by Roxane Gay. And if you're anyone who knows me in real life, you'll know that I am obsessed with 2 Black women academics in particular. One of them is Roxane Gay, and one of them is Tressie McMillan Cotton. Roxane Gay is the woman who introduced me to Black feminism, or to a feminism that wasn't second, third wave white feminism. And Roxane Gay, this woman can write. Her writing reminds me of Christina Sharp's in the way that Christina Sharp's writing is very visceral, and I feel the words when she writes, and she has this turn of phrase, and she writes in these different structures and approaches that make you really pay attention to the words and the sentence structure. Roxane Gay does that, but in a fiction sense. Also nonfiction. Her nonfiction is brilliant too, but I find that her short stories in particular, it'll begin and I'll have an idea of where I think the story is going, and then by the end it's something completely different, and you've just been taken on this amazing journey. So Difficult Women is the book that I'm talking about, and it is a collection of stories from Roxane Gay, which provides a beautiful, haunting vision of modern America. I think it's like 7 or 10 stories about different women and their lives. You've got this one woman who is gorgeous, but is in this very violent domestic, violent type of relationship. There's like a woman married to a twin who kind of pretends that she doesn't notice the twins like changing and like misinterpreting each other, impersonating each other. I will say that these stories are quite sexually explicit in the sense that they do talk about things like sexual violence, sexual harassment, and sexual assault in quite explicit detail. So if that is something that you are unable to read, then this book will not be for you. I did find some of them a bit confronting because I wasn't expecting that. Roxane Gay has a personal history with sexual assault and sexual violence, and I think the ways that she writes about sexual assault and rape in particular is one way of her potentially coming to healing, but also imagining different ways that victims, survivors are able to live after the fact. I really like short stories. I really like short stories that talk about difficult women, title of the book. And I just love Roxane Gay's writing. I would say maybe if this is your first introduction to Roxane Gay, maybe don't read this. Maybe read Hunger, which is her memoir, I think. But this was just a great read for me, and I really liked it because of how powerful it was. And the final book that was on my favorite list is this book that I can't remember where I do remember. I got it because it was one of the Storygraph prompts, and you have to like look at like a book that is under 200 pages or whatever. I got it from the Storygraph's onboarding reading challenge, and this book was for read a book you discovered via the community page. And I think I read this book from someone I follow who I know, and I was like, oh, they have good recommendations, I've never heard of this book before, I'll read it. This is a really, really short book. It's like 200 pages. And I'll read the sort of blurb. So it says, from the acclaimed author of Cantorus comes an incandescent novel, political, mystical, timely, and heartening, about the power of memory and the pursuit of justice. So it's of this, you are reading the like first person perspective of this unnamed Latin American former president, he was a former president of Latin America, and it flips between the current day where this president is being interviewed by a journalist, and he's someone who doesn't really take interviews that much, and then it flips between sort of his time when he was captured. I want to say prisoner of war, but that's not correct. I think he was like part of this guerrilla sort of like resistance group. And this whole idea is that in the book, the president, I think, basically hallucinates in his time of capture that he's speaking to a frog, hence the title of President and the Frog. And I was just so taken aback and so surprised by this book. Yeah, I was just so surprised by this book. First of all, the cover is just so gorgeous. I was immediately captivated by this sort of like kaleidoscopic cover, but I annotated this book a lot on my Kindle because they just had the writing was just so gorgeous. So like one example is in like chapter 6, where the narrator is talking about what it means to be like alone in capture and to not have anyone to speak to. And it reads, "He felt it now, the lack of restlessness, the ability to curl up in a silence as if by a fire, as if silence could be a warm hearth on a cold night, a gentle nesting place for the mind." And I just think this idea of silence as comfort is something that isn't like a brand new idea, but just the sort of the language and the way that it was written. I remember just being like, oh, gorgeous. And then like there's this other part, the people are beautiful, but they're also chaos. Like how apt and how correct is that? I think that I really like this story because it really talked about resilience, but not in this way that it's sort of like you have to continue to try and try and try again in the face of such pain, but rather what it means to have personal resilience in yourself and your own personal resolve to be able to get through a really dark situation. Particularly when it's just you, yourself, and your thoughts. And he talks about sort of like the way that when he was in captivity, when he's sort of talking, it goes flip-flops back between him and the journalist. He talks about how when he was in captivity, he kept thinking about this woman that he was in love with and like the hope of like a better liberatory world. And as someone who is like quite politically politically conscious and also thinks about different alternative ways of systemic change, this was just, for me, it just gave me a lot of hope, I think, just sort of like reading the story. And like there's another quote that I really starred because I loved it so much, but like it says, "There was power in the dream. If words could make a dream come true, we would have transformed the continent with those nights." And this for me really relates to like this Black feminist idea of writing yourselves into the story and writing a different world for yourself that is like a way of thinking otherwise, of theorizing otherwise, of world making, and of creating the world that you want to see. And so this idea that like a dream is powerful, but that also that like if the words in your dream were real, then like the transformation would be so apt and apparent. So yeah, that's The President and the Frog. Oh, I don't think I said who that's by. That's by Carolina de Robertis. And yeah, for me, again, this was a really surprising book because I didn't know what to expect and I really loved it. So yeah, those are my top 6 favorite reads of 2023. Put a comment and let me know if you've read any of those